do you think there's like something new on the horizon that's coming? Like you've really kind of been through it all with people, right?
The biggest trend that I saw was the attraction to podcasting and the amount of money and investment that was coming in. Right. For so long, podcasting was really just a independent, entrepreneurial thing. Lots of hobby podcasts, people who are doing it with their friends.
Welcome to Unplugged, the tech podcast for digital entrepreneurs. I am one of your hosts, Brooke, the founder of the Sober Biz Collective.
Hey, podcasters. My name's Nate Kelly, best-selling author and founder of Podcast Revolution Studios. If you're looking for tech, tools, and tips on how to utilize podcasting for your business, you're in the right spot. Let's get unplugged. Welcome back to Unplugged, my friends, your go-to resource for all things tech in the podcasting world. Brooke and I had the best conversation with our new friend, Mathew Passy. With over 15 years in the podcasting game, Mathew was the driving force behind the Podcast Consultant and Suite Recordings, sharing his expertise as a producer and podcast consultant. I mean, he was all in when Apple released Apple Podcasts, okay? He's an OG. Today, we're diving into his latest venture, podcastingtech.com, with a brand new show in sort of an MTV Cribs style, giving you an inside look at the coolest equipment and studio setups and different price ranges and budgets, which is huge. We're about to get the inside scoop on the latest and greatest in podcasting gear with the one and only Mathew Passy.
I really want to get into this behind the scenes of the podcast studio stuff. It's kind of how me and Nate were actually talking about doing like a Cribs episode of our podcast studio, and then he like sends me something.
I saw your LinkedIn post.
Oh, glad to know there's an appetite for this.
Absolutely. I think a home studio has been definitely booming since 2020, and everybody's moving. This is actually my dining room.
Really?
Yeah, it turned into a home studio.
Wow.
Just make do with what we got, right? So yeah, I'm really excited about that. I want to see what evolves from that project. It's so cool.
Mathew, based on your LinkedIn, it looks like you have a journalism background and that kind of transitioned into this podcasting focus and consulting, and now into podcasting tech. Have you purposefully kind of transitioned as the industry changes, or how has your past ended up to where we are now with launching the podcasting tech side of things?
Well, I think journalism is a little strong of a word, and journalists do a lot more on the ground work of reaching out and talking to people and gathering the stories. A lot of my focus in the news industry was more on production side and kind of the repackaging. So I started working just in radio, supporting our morning news team here at the largest talk station in New Jersey. And while I was there, around 2008 or so, the iPhone launched, and they're like, hey, here's a podcast store. Podcasts have been around, but they were kind of a complicated thing for anybody to figure out. But all of a sudden, Apple's like, we're going to make podcasts easy. And at that point, I was like, this is interesting. And I turned to my boss and I said, maybe we should do something with this. And I was basically told if it doesn't cost him money and he doesn't have to do anything, go for it. So I repackaged some of our content, put it up, and launched my first podcast there. And then my next job was at Dow Jones for Wall Street Journal Radio. And that was a actual 50% radio job, 50% podcasting job. They had been sort of ahead of the game on that front. They had been doing podcasts for a while, even before the Apple store had launched. And so they were really looking to beef that up. And so I spent the next 8 years really focusing on editing, producing, hosting, creating new podcasts for them. And I really thought I was going to be there for a long, long time. But at the end of 2014, they decided to get out of the radio business and shut down everything. So they just laid us all off.
Wow.
Which timing wasn't so great because podcasting at the end of 2014 like blew up with Serial, right? There was a Sarah Koenig spoof on SNL. So not the greatest timing in the world, but whatever. And so 2015, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. And folks who I used to interview regularly for the Journal were saying, hey, those podcasts that we did with you were actually kind of helpful. Could you help us produce it? And I didn't even think that an independent podcast producer was a thing, but I looked around. There's probably about a dozen or so folks doing this, so I decided I would give it a shot. Figure, why not? And lo and behold, that the timing of that was good. It grew, just kept growing and growing and growing. And in 2017, I kind of rebranded and quit everything else that I was doing to focus on that business full time. And COVID happened, right? We were talking about 2020, the pandemic and home studios. And I thought, nobody's going to want to do podcasts. That's an expense nobody needs. And
Right.
boy, was I wrong. Podcasting, had like another super surge. And then you added video on top of that with everybody going into Zoom calls and platforms like StreamYard and Riverside and Squadcast kind of evolving. And so, the business really, really took off. And so I find myself having spent almost 15 years in the podcasting space and trying to figure out what I want to do next. And truthfully, I think I'm going to pivot out of here eventually, but there were so many things that I wanted to do. There were so many ideas that I had while running this production agency that I didn't have time for. And so that's kind of where I'm at today, which is looking into these different ideas and services and hardware that I think would be useful in the podcasting space. And then with podcasting tech, just kind of like downloading a lot of this knowledge that I have and being able to use it in a way that hopefully is useful to folks.
Wow. So you've really been in this game since the beginning. I remember using a program called Mixcloud to have like a little fake podcast with my friends. After a night of drinking, we'd get together and like do like this
Nice.
Mixcloud podcast. So what are some of the trends that you noticed through your time in this podcasting space? And do you think there's like something new on the horizon that's coming? Like, you've really kind of been through it all with people, right?
The biggest trend that I saw was the attraction to podcasting and the amount of money and investment that was coming in. Right. For so long, podcasting was really just a independent, entrepreneurial thing. Lots of hobby podcasts, people who are doing it with their friends, some serious entrepreneurs and digital marketers and folks who were, had the foresight to put out really good content, but a lot of very nichey, technical, self-help kind of stuff, or help you with this, help you with that. Then you had a lot of like stand-up comedians, not bigger ones, but traveling ones who were using it as a good platform. But then, yeah, all of a sudden, large media companies saw the potential here and started to really invest heavily, really pour in a lot of money. I think that's why you see a lot of people saying, is podcasting dead? No, it's not dead. It's just people over invested, overspent, overproduced, overbuilt. They thought there was an infinite amount of ears to listen to, and they just kind of overdid it. So I think that's one of the big things, is just this kind of emergence of the professional
Mm.
podcaster, right? These huge brands, huge celebrities jumping in there. But I don't think podcasting is anywhere near dead. And to your second question, I think there's a lot of potential, a lot more on the horizon for podcasting, with all the technological changes that are happening, all the different ways that people can reach their audience, the way that advertisers can target their audience. I think there's a lot more that could be going on here. And just the fact that you can really put any piece of audio into this feed and send it out there, I think we're still just scratching the surface of creativity in terms of the type of content. Like, I'd love to see more fictionalized podcasts, right? More storytelling, more, like golden age of radio
Yes.
podcasting. I know some people are dabbling in it, but there's not a ton of it out there right now that catches on. I've been thinking about for a long time more localized podcasting. So folks who are not just talking about their state, but maybe even just their county, their town. If you live in a big city, maybe just your neighborhood. I think there's a ton of potential there that's untapped. Uh, and then honestly, with the emergence of video, I think that's just completely, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's changing the game, but it's kind of merging these worlds, and the line between podcaster, YouTuber is starting to get a little hairy. So I think anybody who could create content can be a podcaster, and vice versa. And you really have to think about all the potential distribution channels for your content and whether or not they all make sense. And if they do, like, why not take advantage of as many as you can?
Yeah, I think that brings up a great point about the quality of the content that we're putting out and, understanding kind of that rush of these hobbyists that started shows and realizing now listeners have a choice. And, if your audio is not up to par or if you're not including video, they may scroll on to the next option. So I think now we're kind of weeding out those less than quality shows, perhaps. So I think, focusing on this tech side of things and your audio and your video or podcasting for a cause is important, which is how you and I got introduced to one another. Actually, when I was launching my first show, the Sobriety Diaries, and your episode or our interview launched the same week that I launched my first show. And I can't help but wonder if that was the cause for some of my initial traction, and the rest is kind of history. You introduced me to Dave Jackson, a fellow Ohioan and legend in the industry. So I think that sort of collaboration within the industry and sharing audiences and sharing listeners is something that Brooke and I focus on with clients and in our own launch plan. Is that something that you kind of still focus on and think is important with new shows?
I mean, I think collaboration is always important. No person is an island, right? If you want to do something, if you want to go fast, do it alone. If you want to go far, do it with people. And so I think there's always room to partner, collaborate, work with folks. We talk about one of the most effective ways to grow your audience is to be a guest on other podcasts or, put your trailer or even do like an episode swap with somebody else, right? Kind of talk to somebody else's audience that you can easily get access to. So that's definitely going to be a big piece of it. Uh, going back to what you said earlier about, your quality has to be good. I think there's a limit to that. I always say I've never listened to a podcast that had no direction, was, poorly thought out, has terrible content, but said, I really don't like what they're saying, but the mic sounds so good. I'm going to stick around and listen to it. Like
Yeah,
that never happens. Whereas if you were putting out really strong content, or if you were putting out content that is attractive to your target audience, which doesn't have to be everybody, right? Some people are very successful with only 100 listeners because that's the pool of their audience that they want to reach. You don't have to be NPR quality. You don't have to sound like Joe Rogan. You can get away with a little bit less quality technology. You don't have to be on video. Yes, you are limiting yourself, I would say. And there's certainly going to be people who listen to a show that, somebody's recording on their AirPods and going, oh, I wish they would sound better. And so hopefully with podcasting tech, it's not about everybody having a beautiful looking studio like the two that, both of you have wonderful looking studios. They're just, I love the way the look and the feel and the sound of them. But hopefully we can make suggestions that are just enough for people who are putting out really good content to be passable and to not lose anybody on that front. And truthfully, the technology is getting better and cheaper and easier. And with AI and all these new, assistant programs in the post production, there is little excuse to sound poor. But if you're going to not have great sound, you better be bringing some strong, strong content. You cannot be weak on content and weak on quality. That is a total failure.
great point. And I think quality meaning well thought out content, or quality meaning the tech side of things. I guess a well-rounded show as far as quality. To your point, yes, I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, we did talk about that in an earlier episode. I know I'm definitely guilty of this, where you buy all the fancy things and you're like, okay, I got to sound really good and look really good because I don't actually know what I'm doing. And I need to look like I know what I'm doing. You know what I mean? And then you end up with all this equipment you don't even know how to use. And um, I found like I got stuck in that trap of basically insecurity. Like I'm trying to do everything else but just get on a mic and start talking and start finding my voice and all that kind of stuff. So I love that you just brought that up. What are some like powerful ways to create that content that is going to speak to your audience? Like, what do you think is important in terms of quality content creation?
I think the first thing is it's kind of like what you were saying, that trap you fell into is don't go into this saying, I really want a podcast, but I don't know what it's about.
Yeah.
The shows that tend to be successful, the folks that tend to be successful in the space, they are passionate about something, they are curious about something, they are eager to connect with people, right? Not every successful podcast has to be selling a business or being a how-to, right?
Mhm.
Comedy and companionship, and right, in the case of Sobriety Diaries, like, you know, being able to relate to folks is value as well. So I always say somebody who has value that they can add, somebody who wakes up every day and just cannot stop thinking about whatever X is, and then realizes this medium is a good way to get that out there.
Mm.
That's a more successful way to think about it. So of course, don't just say, I want a podcast. What am I going to do? I don't know. Right. Like, say to yourself, you know, I've been working on whatever in the widget space for so long. I'm an expert on widgets. Nobody's talking about widgets. Let me talk about widgets. Now, once you're in that spot, how do you know what you're going to do is successful? I mean, the best thing you can do is niche down as much as possible, right? Try to find your lane. You know, anybody who says, I'm going to be the next fill in the blank, probably not going to happen. If somebody wants the next whatever, they probably just go and get the original whatever, right? I'm going to be the next Joe Rogan. Why do I need the next Joe Rogan? I have Joe Rogan, right? So don't try and copy everybody else. You can pick and choose a couple of things that they do to help you, but you know, find your lane, find your voice, find your niche, find what you are passionate about, plan, right? If you just go in there with no thought, no plan, it's probably it's not going to sound great, and you're probably going to get very frustrated with it.
Mhm.
But as far as sources for content, I mean, if you're a writer, write your blog posts you can read and write about. Talking to other people in your space, just curiosity. How do they get started? What are they doing? Is a great place to start looking. You know, analyzing the news, whether it's actual, you know, what we see on our televisions or news about your space, news about the thing that you are passionate about. Or if it's just that kind of conversation, we're going to be funny, right? That you said, the mixed cloud, hanging out with our friends after a couple of drinks. It's got to feel like you would have that conversation even if there wasn't a mic in front of you,
Yeah.
right? It's got to feel like you would be sitting in my car chatting with your friend, and it doesn't matter. I always used to say podcasts like no one is listening, and you'll probably have a bigger audience.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should take that quote for for the social
That's a graphic for the episode.
Although I, although I did always say, like, picture one person, right? Like, you know, everybody, we always think about, let me get the biggest audience possible. And so we talk to this microphone like there's 40,000 people out there.
Yeah.
Nobody listens to podcasts in a crowd,
Yeah.
right? We don't gather around the fire and, you know,
So
have
true.
a podcast, right? We listen to them earbuds. We're alone in ourselves. We're commuting, we're traveling, we're running, we're exercising, we're doing the dishes, whatever. Talk to one person and hope that is replicated 40,000 times as opposed to trying to talk to 40,000 people once.
Mm.
Great advice.
Yeah, that's really good. You were talking about collaborations, and that's been brought up a couple of times. I just wanted to know, like, what are some of the collaborations that you did that really helped you with your success in the industry?
I think a lot of them had to do with the tech and, you know, like software companies that are out there. I would go to a lot of podcasting conferences, and I never walked away from those conferences with a ton of clients or anything like that. I never really felt like I grew the business, but I met the, you know, Dave Jacksons of the world who work for Libsyn. I would meet the Mark Asquiths of the world who work for Captivate. I would be intrigued by, you know, somebody who's rolling out the latest technology that's going to make people sound good or look good. And for me, having that curiosity, having that desire to want to play with the, you know, new shiny object really kept me on my toes. And it also just allowed me to ask a lot of people questions and feed off their experiences, their knowledge. Similarly, that would happen when, so we had a production business, right? That was our bread and butter. People would record podcasts, send it to us. We'd edit, produce, publish, whatnot. And then I started doing this thing called a podcast audit, where somebody who already had a podcast would come and say, we have this podcast, we have no audience. Like, what are we doing wrong? And we would analyze the show and look at it and talk to them. And that also helped a lot. Talking to a lot of people about why they were podcasting, what their thinking was, what they were trying to accomplish, why they use this interesting format. It allowed me to really have a broad spectrum of thoughts. I wasn't very narrowly focused. I was able to say, huh, that's interesting. That's not going to work for everybody, or that exact style isn't going to work, that exact way, but I can take that and tweak it a little bit, and now boom, it's perfect for this person. So it's just really just being curious and asking a lot of questions and being willing to listen. I mean, a lot of people say when you go to these conferences, the best sessions are always the hallway sessions. And I couldn't agree more. Just chatting with new people and getting to understand what everybody is doing, I think is one great way to collaborate with in this space. When I first started working independently in podcasts around 2015, 2016, these conferences were really just starting to grow. I think, around the first podcast movement, some of the early pod fests, there were a lot of people who thought, I go to a podcast conference to grow my show. And if you're thinking that you're going to go to a podcast conference to grow your show, you're going to be in for a really large slice of disappointment. Most podcasters are not your audience, right? And the truth is, because really good podcasters are all niche down, you can't roll into Podfest and be like, hey, I've got a podcast about widgets, and expect the guy with the horse training podcast to care. They don't. So if you go in there thinking I'm going to grow my audience, you're probably not going to have a good time. But if you go in there and, like you were saying, and like we were just, talking about, listen, what I hear most from people is that they got inspiration. They got new ideas. They kind of got the push either to get started on something that they've been hesitant to doing, right, Brooke? You said, what am I going to say into this microphone, right? They get motivated, inspired. They see the potential in what others are doing. And so that's always a good piece of it. And often they can see, we can often be siloed in lots of different ways in our lives. And so if you happen to be in this one, corner of the internet that says the only way you do a podcast is this way, and that way is outdated or is very limited, or truthfully, it only applies to this subset of people, you are probably missing out on all the opportunities and all the potential that is out there. Whereas a podfest, the podcast movement, all those different shows allow you to see what lots of people are doing, lots of creative ideas, lots of interesting ideas, lots of things you would go, really? That works? They go, yeah, that works. And again, you can't always copy everything they do exactly. You have to embody the spirit of it, but make it your own.
Mm.
And that, I think, is usually what people who go to these conferences, that's the best thing they get out of them.
Yeah, when I started my first professional podcast, we booked a table at Vampod Fest up in Vancouver here in Canada. And I had just started podcasting like as a career. Like, this is what we're going to be doing. We registered as a business. We've got a business account. We're going to take this seriously. And I think it was so valuable to hear from people that had been doing it for years that it took a lot of pressure off my back, honestly, because some people were like, you can do every 2 weeks if that works for you. Like, just stay consistent, just don't give up. It takes a while to grow, like getting feedback. And then I also found that a lot of those people would send us guests and say, hey, I know somebody who'd be perfect for your show. And then we ended up getting guests through that as well. And there's people I talk to still today on Instagram and stuff. We just share tips with each other. And it's really cool. I feel like there's a niche community of podcasters, and we all want to see each other do well because we've all been in this grind and see how hard it can be. So I love that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. That's the one thing, is you never go to a podcast conference and feel like you're in competition. It always feels like everybody wants to support everybody. Now, that doesn't mean the audience is limitless and, we don't have to fight for our audience, but most of the time, most podcasters are not out there trying to, undercut you or make you feel bad or anything like that. And if they are, just, ignore them.
So, Mathew, podcastingtech.com. Tell us, I know you're kind of beta testing the show. When can we expect the launch, or where can people go otherwise to find out more about you, or, if they're interested in working together?
So yeah, podcasting tech, not sure when what we're doing will be released, but hopefully, fingers crossed, by mid to late February, if not definitely by March, we'll release our first few episodes of the show. It'll be a mix of studio tours, like kind of like a cribs for podcast setups. And then the other episodes will be highlighting different technology, hardware, software, whatever that should be beneficial and useful to the podcasting audience.
Mm.
So that should be coming out by the end of February. Again, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
But also, it will have a bunch of recommendations for equipment packages, things like, right, you're just starting out, how do I do it? Or, I want to be podcasting in person in my office, whether you need something portable, right? We would say this. If you want something more permanent, go with this. We need to have 4 people. We need to travel with it, right? We'll kind of put together all sorts of little features to make it easy for you to figure out what it is that works best for your setup. And then as we're growing it out, hopefully get a chance to test out some new equipment, right? Maybe I got to get my hands on the Zoom Q89 and see if it's really good 4K camera. And do reviews and unboxings and things like that. And then that'll also be a platform where hopefully we are able to jump off from there with some of the other ideas that we're working on in the background, like that kind of all-in-one solution we were talking about a little earlier is in development, and that might be a place where we would talk about it and you'd find it. And studio design stuff would be advertised there. So podcastingtech.com, the site is live. It is very bare bones. It's a pod page right now. And since we have no episodes, there's not much on there. But in the meantime, otherwise, if you just search for my name, Mathew Passy, you'll just find my social media stuff. And I haven't been super active lately, but I will be jumping back on there in earnest pretty soon. I've spent the last few months raising a puppy, so that's been my full-time job.
It sure is. Yes, it is. Matthew, many thanks, my friend. So happy to reconnect. I appreciate the tech mastery talk today. And thanks for coming on Unplugged.
It is my pleasure. Great to reconnect with you, and great to see how successful you've been with everything since our first conversation almost 3 years ago. And keep up the good work, both of you.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. It's great to meet you.
Thanks so much for hanging out today. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube for all of our video content at Unplugged Tech Pod.
And join us in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/unplugged podcast. Also, make sure to throw us a 5-star review if you are finding this content valuable for you and your digital business. We accept all forms of reviews: Apple Podcasts, Spotify follows, YouTube, telling your grandmother about us.
And make sure to share the episode with one person in your life who may find it valuable. And we'll see you next time on Unplugged.
I think it's good enough, and we're just going to keep getting better.